international recognition in the 1990s. So we are very fortunate to have this wonderful exchange of minds today, and Fleur Donglai-Shi will be the interpreter for their conversation. Fleur is the academic secretary of the Oxford Chinese Studies Society and the main powerhouse behind all of our great academic events. He is a DPhil candidate in English here at Oxford, and his thesis focuses on the Yellow Peril as a traveling discourse in modern Anglophone and Sinophone literatures. His articles have been published in many academic journals, including Women of Culture Review, Clear, Comparative Literature, and World Literature. He's currently working on an edited volume in Ibidem's World Literature series entitled World Literature in Motion, Institution, Recognition, and Location. So we'll open up the floor for audience Q&A in the second half of the event, and a drinks reception will be held in the back room over there. You're welcome to go help yourself to drinks, and in the meantime, we'll also be selling copies of Professor McDonald's book right there. Card is preferred, unless if you have exact cash. And without further ado, I will turn it over to our speakers. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, and thank you all for coming on this day. Of course, with the weather in the last few days, we were slightly nervous about everybody being able to get around, but it's a real pleasure to see so many of you here. I also wanted to just thank Fleur, Linda, and the Oxford Chinese Studies Society for all the labour that went into organising this event, which was considerable. And in particular, just a few other quick words of thanks before we start, and that is to St. Hugh's and all the support staff who have helped manage everything and organised the reception for afterwards and so on. And finally also Honora, who is looking after the books for me at the desk over there. So, and all of these people are giving their labour for nothing, which is great, very, very helpful. The key person, of course, to thank is Hugh for making some time in his schedule, which I know is incredibly packed, to come back to Oxford, because this is, for me at least, I'm right in saying it's the second time, and the last time was 2013. Yeah, it was 2013 when Hugh came here for an absolutely stunning exhibition, landscape at the Ashmolean in 2013 was the last time he came here, and we also got him to give some lectures and some other talks. So it's a real pleasure to have him back and to get him to speak about his work in Oxford once again. I don't want to say too much about my book at this point, just a few things really to suggest some of the reasons why my encounters with Hugh Bing's work had a transformative effect on the process of writing this book and of my own thinking. I'll just sketch a few things about that as a bit of background before asking Hugh Bing some questions that I've always wanted to ask him, get him to talk a little bit more about certain aspects of his own work. And then, as Linda said, we'll definitely hand it over to you for questions from the floor. So if I have to say very briefly and succinctly what this book is about, then the word that I would come up with is this one. Of course, what I say is the word connections, but what Hugh Bing and Fleur Donglai-Shi will say is
关系.
Thanks very much. It is a book about connections, but it's also a book about a very particular kind and set of connections. And again, in English, I would say these are invisible but not hidden connections. Now I'll try to explain a little bit more about that. But Hugh Bing and Fleur would say,
隐而不藏.
Can everybody hear that clearly enough? Yes? You might want to put the microphone a little closer.
Okay. 隐而不藏.
Yeah. So the big question is, why are these connections invisible but not hidden? And I'm only going to highlight two reasons as to why these connections tend to get buried or obscured. And the first one is that some of the connections are so familiar to us, or at least the things that we're talking about are so familiar to us, so intimate with us, so close to us, that we simply don't see them anymore. And the most obvious one, and this is part of what I learned from Hugh Bing's work, but also from some other works which I'll mention briefly in a moment, one of the things that we are most familiar with is the writing system that we grew up with and were taught most of us, through formal schooling of one kind or another. And just to randomly choose one example of our writing system, I will go for this one. Of course, I would say that as artifacts of writing, and Hugh and Flair might put it slightly differently. Sorry, we're having some translation going on in the process, which is fine. Yeah. So, Flair, how would you say your translation of the title?
文物
Of course, what I mean by artifacts of writing is not necessarily the same thing as the translation, which is part of what we might be talking about. But anyway, okay, so back to the connections that are hidden, not hidden, but invisible in this bit of writing. Here, there's some ways in which we could talk about this. You might all be giving certain meanings to those English words. Of course, one of the things is that we would simply initially, for people brought up in the writing system that I was initially taught, I would recognize these as English words, and I would there, at a certain level, just dealing with the words, I wouldn't necessarily sort of have thought about it at all, that there's a Latinate word in artifacts actually come from Latin, and that of and writing come from ancient Germanic languages. So that's one level at which we could talk about certain sorts of connections that are not necessarily particularly visible to all of us all the time because these are so familiar English words. But I don't want to talk about the words. What I really want to focus on is the letters, of which there are 12 distinct letters in the English title that I'm talking about. And the key thing here is a simple one, and that is that the letters, those 12 letters, or at least 11 of them, take us to, and I have a fantasy version of what I'm about to show you, take us to a young Roman boy, as I like to imagine him, on the banks of the Thames, sometime around 60 in the Common Era, the year 60, so about 5 years or so after Julius Caesar invaded Britain. Sometime around there, this young boy was learning how to write, and he learned on a thing that looked like this. This is the oldest known artifact of writing in Britain. It was found 2 years ago while the Thames, a new underground train line is being built in London, and they discovered a treasure trove of astonishingly preserved wax tablets. About 405 of them. It's near Bank Tube Station, for those of you that know. And they discovered these wax tablets. Most of them are quite interesting everyday things with IOUs and complaints and various other things written on them. But one of them has somebody learning their letters. And as you can see, most of the letters of the alphabet, of the Latin alphabet, are there. A, B, C, you can see faintly marked out. There's one missing letter, and it could be just because of this wax tablet, and that's E. But we'll just, it could be that there's just randomly missing. Of course, the Latin alphabet had the letter E. But there is, in fact, one key letter that is missing, and that's the letter W. And the reason for that is, of course, it didn't exist in the Latin alphabet, certainly for my young Roman boy learning his letters 5 years after Caesar invaded. And that's because that letter, W, was added by Norman scribes to the Latin alphabet around about the 11th century. It's one of the reasons why, of the 26 letters in the English alphabet, it's the only one that doesn't have a distinct name of its own. A, B, C, D, E, F, all that. This one is called W. There's also another interesting story as to why the French call that W. But the reason for that is that in the 5th century, so a century after the Romans left, Old English scribes initially used the runic character win as to capture that W sound, which was not in the Latin in Latin at all. It was a Germanic sound. They pinched a runic character to represent that, but by the 11th century Norman scribes had decided to change that to a ligatured U, two U's, double U. So that's one connection to another, to 1,000 years ago, and Norman scribes, which takes us to a world beyond our Roman boy learning his letters just after Caesar arrived. The other one, and one of my favorite ones, of things that are invisible but not hidden and that we fail to see in the English writing system, is one that you would probably not think of as a character at all, and rightly so, because all it is a blank space. And that's between the letter of and writing. That, believe it or not, was invented by Irish monks in the, or at least perfected by Irish monks in the 7th century, and as a device for separating words. And the reason why they wanted to add that to the writing system, which for them, of course, at that point was Latin that they were using for their new Christian faith, is that the standard way in which Latin manuscripts, which are the basis of their Christian faith, at that point got to them, they were written in what was called scriptio continua, which they found very, very difficult to read. And if I show you the next slide, you might understand why they found that difficult to read. So they introduced blank space in order to create word separation, in order to make the English writing system more legible. Because of course for them, their new Christian faith was coming to them in a language which was foreign. And also it was not only a foreign language by the 7th century, at that time it was largely for them a language of the eye. They weren't hearing it anymore as a kind of everyday spoken Latin. It was something that they just saw. Okay, so that's one of the reasons why these things are invisible to us. These are connections, obviously deep historical connections pointing in all sorts of directions, which the writing system itself reveals. But there's another set of reasons why these things become invisible, and in this case it has less to do with the simple familiarity that we have with all our writing system, that we're blind to these things, and much more to do with a concerted and larger scale effort of erasure. And in particular, for my book, it's a form of erasure that is produced by the ways in which modern states conceptualize themselves. There's a way in which the state is conceptualized leads to a certain range of connections being erased, forgotten, or consciously excluded in some way or other. And here, this is of course at the center of the book in various ways, but I'm just going to choose more or less at random because I don't talk about these states in any great detail in the book at all. I've talked mainly about Ireland, South Africa, and India, but the two states I can mention, just to give you an idea of where this conceptualization leads to a certain kind of erasure, is Pakistan and Bangladesh. And here we can just simply dwell on the word. Pakistan is in fact a wonderful coinage. It's an acronym combining 5 regions of the old British Raj. But as you can see, it is also the word, the name of the country itself is derived from the Persian and Pashto word pak, meaning pure, which is added to the suffix stan. Of course, I did also add there that the Persian, which means place of. So in other words, Pakistan means place of the pure. I don't think you need to know much about the political history of South Asia to know that even the fact that the Persian word has a connection to the Sanskrit word stana behind that is controversial. And in terms of the language politics of Pakistan, which I'm sure many of you know in this room know, those connections are not connections that necessarily many Urdu speakers want to remember. But that's an obvious version of a conceptualization of the state which excludes certain sorts of connections. But another one, which is in many ways much more common, is just simply the idea that Bangladesh, the Bengali words meaning often just the land or country of the Bangla speakers. Again, just to recall the complications, we need to know that Bangladesh is not the only place in which Bangla or Bengali is spoken, because there's also the Indian state of West Bengal, which again, if you know your history of South Asia, is a complex history of exclusion and division of various kinds. So that's maybe high-minded and taking us into various aspects of linguistic and political history. But I should mention now that, of course, for me, there were many much more concrete and significant ways in which my work and what I was doing became connected to Xubing. And in this case, the key point of connection was nothing to do with languages and the formation of the modern state, but something to do with a far more everyday thing, which is what I call lunch.
午餐
There you go. And in this case, for me, it's one of the pleasures of working in an Oxford college, and in St Hugh's in particular, is that at lunch, every day, you get to sit down next to world experts in certain fields that are not your own. We have a kind of informal, interdisciplinary seminar that goes on every day, which is just called lunch. And in this case, the key person for me was Sheila Venker, who is lucky enough for me, is the curator of Chinese art in the Ashmolean Museum, and was in fact the curator of the wonderful landscape exhibition of Xubing's in 2013. The point of this was that I was sitting down having lunch I think at least 10 years ago, with Sheila, and I inadvertently mentioned to her my unhealthy interest in a particular book, which is this one. As I'm sure many of you who know this book, it is a book that you confess an interest in only secretly and under duress. T.S. Eliot called it beautiful nonsense. That's fine as a description of it as beautiful nonsense. The trouble is it's beautiful nonsense that goes on for 628 pages. So that is, most people can handle nonsense in a short limerick poem and get something out of that, but to have nonsense for 628 pages is beyond most of us. But the key thing is, Sheila heard what I was saying about my interest in Finnegan's Wake, and she said, well, if you're interested in that kind of thing, you really need to look at this guy's work. And that was Xubing. And so I then started to delve into his work, and very quickly started to see her point, because I came across things like this. So at this point, you all need to practice your reading. If anybody can start reading it, please do. I can see there are some moments of what I want you to do, not so much is to necessarily wrestle with what's in front of you, but to think about the process, remember the process of what you're about to go through. Because the key thing that I started to pick up from Xubing's work is that what was demanded by it was for me to re-educate my eyes. And that's what it has been, a process of re-educating my eyes. And as you'll see, in some ways, that is precisely what Joyce also wants us to do with Finnegan's Wake. In fact, it's what I would think any of the literature that I want to take seriously is about re-educating our eyes, amongst other things, beginning with the fact that it's a graphic medium. So many of you may have started to see something in this familiar, but maybe it'll help a little bit if I give you this. Are you starting to see it now? So you have to start reading from the left, and you have to read from top to bottom. So that's, again, depending on your training and where your eye initially goes on a page, as to how you read. maybe easy or not so easy. But if we begin on the left, in the top left-hand corner, and go down, Song of Myself, poem by Walt Whitman. And then we go to the next column, if we just start from the top. I celebrate myself and sing myself, and so it goes on. And what I assume, you shall assume for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. This is one of Hugh Bing's wonderfully inventive games, demanding games with writing systems called the New English Calligraphy or Square Word Calligraphy. It goes by various names.
Yeah.
And does it have a Mandarin name?
英文方块字。
English square words in Mandarin. Once you've had a little bit of practice, it gets a little easier. So this one might be easier for some of you.
Very good.
I can hear people getting it already. You see, your education is very quick, very rapid. So this is Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water. Jack forward. You'll see at the end there, nursery rhymes 5, Hugh.
XUBND.
Yeah.
I actually read from the left to right, from top to bottom,
Yeah.
from outside to inside. So, yeah, I actually like a Chinese order.
Yeah. So these were moments in which I started to completely look at my own writing system, my own literate brain and how it had been trained, and to think again about the very basics of what I was doing as somebody who's capable of reading in what is for English readers the Latinate, essentially the Latinate or the Greco-Roman writing system is the one that we use. And here, Hugh Bing was playing games with this. What I started to do is I started to go beyond his work and start to look at the intellectual and philosophical traditions that informed him. I learned more about him and his own background. What I then discovered was that what I was looking at in a lot of things, and a way of actually thinking about the literature that I myself focus on and deal with is a version of the koan, which, as you can see here from the, which I say koan, but
Koan. I guess it's Japanese.
it's very, well, the Oxford English Dictionary says that English got this from Japanese. And once I started to see this and see the importance of it for Hugh Bing's thinking, I started to realize, actually, in fact, this is exactly how I think about the kind of literature that I want to write about and take seriously. It is essentially koan, public matter or material for thought. That's really what I engage with. And the most important tradition in which this, of course, has been developed is the tradition of Chan or Zen Buddhism, where, again, according to the OED, giving a fairly standard definition of it, is it's a paradox put to a student to stimulate his or her mind. It is partly via Hugh Bing's work coming into contact with that tradition of Zen Buddhism. I then started to see and to begin to think that maybe the best way of thinking about what Finnegan's Wake is an overly long, it's 628-page koan. And I'm not going to give you much of it, but here's just one or couple of sentences. Again, I'm just pausing for you to look at them with your eyes, because it then becomes controversial as to how I read it, as to what you might hear. But let me give you one reading of it, and you can think about whether that's a plausible one. Mars, but the magic Wavus has Elfinin on meshes, and Simba the slayer of his ogre is slewed. I will just hint at the other possibilities. Is I could have said not magic, I could have said magic. and that's partly because a Kiswahili word for water, maji, is buried in the spelling magic, maji. We can talk at length about what Joyce is doing, but it is this koan-like effect that I discovered via Xu Bing as a way of thinking about not just what's going on in Philippines Way, but a lot of the literature that I would talk about in this book. So it's at this point, having spoken at far too much length, I'm afraid, but at this point I did want to hand over and to start to ask Xu Bing a little bit more about his own relationship to the Zen or Chan Buddhist tradition, and in particular if he could elaborate for us on the importance of this book for him in his own intellectual and artistic and creative development, which is Daiitsu Suzuki's book, An Introduction to Zen Buddhism, which was initially published in the 1930s in English. It actually was a book designed in partly by a Japanese scholar to introduce Western readers to this tradition. But Xu Bing has said in various interviews and moments, he's mentioned this book and said it was very important. It became a really key book for him in his own formation. But what I would wonder is if he could just say a little bit more to us about that, when he read it, where he read it, what initial importance he started to feel he could derive from it, and how and what ways he took it to heart.
Okay. 对，首先是我很高兴来参加 Peter 的这个新书的这个发布会啊，因为呢，在13年是吧？13年的时候，我第一次跟 Peter 接触，刚才他已经介绍了，通过这个 Shiva， 后来我就觉得这个教授特别有意思，我觉得他呢，他的思维非常有意思，知道吧？我觉得他一定是一个非常好的老师。
First, I'm really happy to have come to Oxford to see Peter again, and back in 2013 I came to Oxford upon his invitation, and as he already told you that we met for the first time through the introduction of Schiller, and at that time I already thought that Peter is really a thoughtful intellectual and a good professor.
所以从今天这个活动的这个人这么多，我就知道这个教授在牛津的这个人气有多旺。
So just to tell from the turnout today, I can already get the sense that how popular he is in Oxford.
这可能是我参加过的这个新书发布会人最多的一次。
So this is probably the most popular book launch event I've ever been to.
当然呢，那个实际上呢，我读这个，就是说我对这个禅宗有兴趣。是在80年代。
So actually, I first got interested in Zen Buddhism in the 1980s.
因为什么呢？那个时候呢，其实中国的整个的文化界基本上都是向西方学习，学习西方的这个当代哲学和当代理论的这么一个热潮之下。
So back in the 1980s, that was the time where when China was learning all kinds of contemporary philosophical and cultural knowledge from the West.
所以我呢，当然也是作为一个年轻人，也特别希望接受新思想，所以呢，也是硬是去读这个西方的这些哲学的著作，德里达呀，什么荣格呀，什么这那的，
So as a young person back then, just to force myself to accept this kind of new thought from the West, I had to force myself to read some of the theories like Derrida or Carl Jung.
但是说实在的，我呢可能是一个真的是一个非常汉人，你知道吧？那些著作呢，对我来说真的是很难读进去啊。
So, but maybe for me that I'm really like too Chinese for those thoughts, so it's pretty difficult for me back then.
当然，我现在想呢，一个是思维真的是有比较大的差距，再一个呢，也可能当时的翻译呢，可能就有各种各样的。可能原著就很难懂，在翻成中文以后就根本不知道在说什么。
So maybe it's because of the huge cultural difference between the two traditions, but maybe I thought the translation between the translation of the works may not be as good since the original works were already difficult enough.
但是有一天呢，其实我读了一本小书，其实就是这本书，我今天也带了方法论，包括性格中，包括我们说话的这种语气中，接人待物的关系中，其实呢是充满了这个禅的方法的。
And then I found out that for most of the East Asians in our culture, Zen Buddhism has its influence in how our character is shaped and even the tone in which we are talking to people and the way we deal with relations between people.
其实禅呢，对我来说呢，我后来发现这个禅其实呢，它不是一种宗教，它也不是一个哲学，其实它是一种最朴素的一个生活方法。
Then I discovered that Zen Buddhism is neither a religion nor a philosophy. It's actually a very simple style of life.
实际上呢，它实际上是一种生活智慧。
It's actually a form of wisdom of life.
特别是这个 Suzuki， 就是说刚才 Peter 讲到这个公案，实际上这个就是其实禅和这个佛教其实还有很多的流派和很多的这种倾向啊。但是呢，其实这个 Suzuki 呢，他特别强调的是禅的这种直接性，就是禅的这种直接性啊。
So even for the Zen Buddhism Suzuki speaks of, or including the koan, as mentioned by Peter, there are lots of different schools of thought. But what has drawn me to Suzuki's interpretation is the directness of the Zen.
其实，在禅中间呢，比如说这个佛教，后来发展了很多的这种方向和流派啊。这个 Suzuki 呢，他叫玄寂宗。玄寂宗呢，就是说他比较强调思想，就是他强调思想的一种启示，而你先看。
So among all the different schools of Buddhism, Suzuki has put the emphasis on the thinking process of the Zen and called 玄寂宗 the process, and it's more about a process of epiphany.
实际上，那个禅宗呢，它后来发展的不是禅宗，就是说佛教，是吧？还有不同的流派的禅宗，其实它有时候发展成了一种很玄学的东西。再一个，另外一部分呢，就发展成了一种非常形式主义的东西，或者说有一种这种崇拜物的东西。
Okay, so Zen Buddhism.
没那么复杂。
So Zen Buddhism has many schools, and there are several different developments. One development was more towards the esoteric, so-called 玄学 trend, and another would be the more formalistic one, 形式主义. So for Suzuki, it would be more on the thinking process.
对，我觉得是一种非常朴素的东西。
A very simple, pure thing.
Great. I mean, if I can, I don't want to tie everybody down to one particular passage, but there's one further dimension of this that I would really love to be able to develop this evening a little bit, and that is the kind of because it was also one of the things that had a transformative effect on me. And I was very pleased that Xu Bing mentioned reading Derrida in the 1980s. I went through a similar sort of experience, and yes, it has left a permanent mark on me reading those works, but it was also discovering Suzuki through you that actually helped me look at Finnegan's Wake in a new way, which is not with Derrida's eyes, but with, in a sense, a different set of eyes, but also find my way out of a certain interpretation of Derrida, which is not, I don't think, very helpful. But there's the double dimension I wanted to talk a little bit about more is also captured by Xu Bing's two companion pieces, which we'll maybe use as the kind of closing segment of our bit, to talk about a little bit further. And the one is we've already mentioned from the beginning. It is the work that made Xu Bing's name in the late 1980s, early 1990s, which is Tian Xu, known as Book from the Sky in English. Should we maybe just let Xu Bing describe this to everyone rather than me? Yeah. Initially, I will just describe what it is, and then we can take it from there.
你说这个其实就是天书这个作品，它是一个以这个装置的形式呈现。Installation。可以用简单的英文来介绍一下这个啊，因为经常介绍。当然你们提问题的时候，我就需要翻译。然后这个 they call book from the sky. Actually, it's an installation. I want to making the installation look like a space of the jail of the world. That when the people getting in, they see lots of beautiful traditional Chinese language. Yeah. But they're so beautiful. The book is a really beautiful book. The really 就是非常吸引
It's attractive.
attracted people to read it. But at the same time, they push you away. You couldn't really read it because any characters made by myself actually it's fake, right? Yeah, well, we can.
So here you can see a close-up of the book, and here's a close-up of the characters.
And I did it really serious, yeah, because I think this kind of like is 也不能说是一个 joke， 也不能说是一个 joke， 就是说它其实是一个东方的这种，其实也是一个禅的方法，就是说我很认真的说这个事儿，但其实我说的是别的事儿。
So what I meant is not really a joke, but it's actually a Oriental mode of method to talk about something that really seriously, but what I'm really talking about is something else.
他给你一个特别的文字的外表，但是它的内部呢，其实和文字没有关系。
So it gives you the facade of a special language, but it's the core of it has nothing to do with language.
比如说，任何人，我们很多人都说它是文字，或者说天书，这个 nonsense 这个 book， 大家都说它是书，但是严格讲呢，我们不能说它是文字，我们也不能说这个书是书，因为它不给你任何的作为文字的信息。
Many people have told me that they see Tianshu as language or they see it as a book, but actually I think it's neither language or book. It's because it doesn't carry information.
That's maybe where I could come in with the one. So the one side of the Zen Buddhist tradition that I got from both Xu Bing and Tian Shu specifically, and the formulations that Suzuki came up with, the one side of it has to do definitely with a radical experience of doubt. And this is the quotation that I thought I would read from Suzuki, where he says this, and it really picks up on what Xu Bing was just saying about it not being a joke entirely. And he says here, the koan, this is Suzuki, the koan is neither a riddle nor a witty remark. It has a most definite objective, the arousing of doubt and pushing it to the furthest limits. Okay, so it's that experience which of course with Tian Shu, the thing that always interests me, and I know it interests Xu Bing, is that for me, as somebody who cannot read, or I can read about 50, 60 Chinese characters, but anything beyond that is difficult for me. I, of course, first encounter this and think, this is Chinese, I can't read this. But of course, for many of you in this room, you encounter this and possibly first think, this is a Chinese in a script I don't understand, or whatever it might be. Or you will try to find and recognize some characters as people have done. But the experience, certainly, of the koan that Suzuki is talking about, on the one side, is this experience of radical doubt, in particular about writing and what writing can deliver.
其实这个禅宗呢，特别是Suzuki 他提倡的这个禅宗的这一脉的精神呢，实际上是特别的反对逻辑，和什么呢？和这个反对二元，就是什么东西都是二元的。比如说，他说煤是黑的，是吧？啊，但是作为禅师呢，他就可以说这个煤是白的，血是黑的。就是实际上禅宗呢，它实际上是把我们已经有的知识范畴的东西，给你打碎。
So what Suzuki tries to promote is actually a spirit against logic and binaries. So even if some people would say that snow is white, but then philosophers cannot actually argue that it's black. What Suzuki tries to get away with is this kind of binary knowledge system.
实际上，禅里有一句话，我觉得说的特别好，就是说这个。在没有任何可供参照的前提下，这个佛才出现。
So I particularly like one saying from Suzuki, which is that only when there is no reference system, then the Buddha will appear.
所谓这个参照，就是说这个我们的知识和我们的用的非常习惯的逻辑，和我们的思维的一种知识教育的一个习惯。
So the reference system here refers to the kind of familiar logic gained through our education.
但是我的其实有一些作品呢，包括 Peter 介绍的我的一些作品呢，其实就是等于是给观众的这个知识的思维或者逻辑的思维，给逼到一个两难的一个死角上。
So many of my works, including the ones Peter mentioned, actually try to push the audience thinking into a cul-de-sac or a dilemma.
因为呢，比如说这个我们对文字的认识，其实文字是功能性的，它一定要给我们说事情。
For example, our familiar interpretation with language is that it focuses on its functionality and it has to deliver information to us.
可是面对这样的所谓的文字呢，其实就是我们的现有的这个知识范畴，它没法解释。
So when facing this so-called language system I put up here, our current knowledge system cannot really offer an explanation.
就像刚才 Peter 介绍这个square word calligraphy， 因为我们有这个中文是什么，我们也有这个知识的概念告诉我们英文是什么，但是呢，面对这样的说法的时候呢，这两个概念都不工作，就是我们没有一个现成的概念来解释这样的说法。
So when facing works like square word calligraphy, it is neither Chinese nor English, and in our current knowledge system, it cannot really be put down into any of these boxes.
其实禅宗的方法和激活人的思想的方法，其实就是在你的思维的惯性中制造一个障碍。
So the actually radical stimulating part of Zen Buddhism is to create obstacles in your familiar ways of thinking.
当你这个障碍呢，其实是就像电脑死机一样的，让你这个电脑死机以后再重启的时候，其实它会给你带来更多的这个思维的空间和这个更合理的一个运营的一个关系。
So this process is really like when a computer hits a bug and stops working, but then you reboot it, and then it gives you a refreshing environment.
And we should, if we focus on Tianshu, you might have the illusion that it's only the Chinese writing system that can be subjected to this kind of treatment, but in fact across the range of Xu Bing's work, this skeptical, radical doubt tradition of the Zen Buddhist in Zen Buddhism that pushes our familiar concepts to their limits applies across all scripts and languages. As you can see from this work, which is, you can see nonsense words in the Latinate writing system on one pig and the Chinese writing system on another. We can talk about this afterwards if you want to. It's a wonderful take on literacy in all sorts of directions. But if we also look at the another work like A Monkey's Grasp for the Moon, which is a massive wooden installation, which you can see with various hanging characters. You will see, and if you look at the design and mock-up for it, you'll notice that just about every key writing system gets incorporated into this. And in this particular case, it's also interesting because it is based on a Zen Buddhist folk tale about monkeys going down a well and thinking that they can get hold of the moon and touch the moon, which is in the bottom of the well in a reflection. It's again pushing at the notion of what Xu Bing was saying about reference and information via language, thinking about that. But the thing that I wanted to end with, this segment, is really to turn to the other side. Because in many ways, this aspect of the Zen Buddhist tradition, which I think was put powerfully and very clearly in Suzuki's book, but also then articulated in fascinating visual ways by Xu Bing himself, was only one side of it. Because the other side of Suzuki's argument is that in the Zen Buddhist tradition, it's not simply a negative experience of doubt. What he constantly keeps emphasizing is that it is also always about vitality, about freedom and originality. Those are some of his words again: vitality, freedom and originality. And the other sentence he says, which also stuck with me, is each time Zen is asserted, things get vitalized. There is an act of creation. So for me, again, having read Derrida, having read a certain version of what I regarded as a fairly exhausted and bankrupt Euro-American postmodernist tradition was part of my own formation, I suddenly started to see something much more positive coming out of this tradition. That it was a tradition not simply of doubt, of pushing things to their limits, but it's a tradition of creative doubt, a positive tradition of doubt. And that flips to the other side of Xu Bing's oeuvre, which had a huge impact on me. And the book ends with a discussion of these two things: Tianshu, and its companion piece, which is in the title itself, is Book from the Ground, which is this book here. This is it here in its codex form as a book. It also exists as a website. I know it's been published as a bit of serial fiction in a Chinese newspaper. It takes many forms. And what this is, again, I'm going to hand over to Xu Bing to describe it in more detail. But what I'll do, I'll just show you is the contents page. And I'll just show you one example. The question I have for you, Xu Bing, maybe as our last point in this more formal part of the discussion before we hand over to you for questions, is you deliberately, certainly in English, named this project in relation to Book from the Sky. It's difficult to see Book from the Ground as not being, in some ways, a companion to Book from the Sky. And I just wondered how you understood that companionship and the sort of double-sidedness of that. For me, of course, this was one of the things for me was that this was a positive experience of creative doubt, encountering this work. But it's just how you understood the relationship that the connection that you wanted to represent by naming the works in that way.
其实教地书呢是和这个天书那个作品呢是有一定的联系性的啊，因为呢实际上这两本书中间隔了差不多有25年的时间啊。
So I was trying to give some kind of relationality between Book from Sky and Book from Ground, but actually the two books have a distance of 25 years between them.
但是这两本书呢是截然不同。
These two books are completely different.
对，那本书呢是没有一个人能读懂，包括我自己在内。
Book from the sky, no one can really read it.
including myself 但是这个地书呢，其实是任何人都能读的。
So for book from the ground, anyone can read it.
对，它其实是超越这个地域文化和这个教育等级的。
So it's actually it actually transcends geography, culture, and educational levels.
对，因为对它的阅读的能力不取决于你的教育程度的高低。
So it doesn't depend on your levels of education for you to understand it.
对，这个其实孩子读的挺快的。
So the children actually read it quite fast.
对，但是呢，知识分子或者教授其实读起来有点慢，因为我们有太强的文化的固定的概念。
So and actually intellectuals and professors take more time to read it because we have so much consolidated knowledge about culture.
对，但是这两本书呢，它的内部呢有一定的类似性，比如说这两本书对所有人都是平等。
But actually, these two works have some similarities between them. For example, people are equal when they are in front of these two works.
所以我后来就叫它地书。
Then I thought, oh, maybe I just call it book from the ground.
因为这本书里面的所有的，我们说它是文字也好，或者 icon 也好，或者 emoji 也好，其实没有一个是我自己设计的，而全部是收集来的。
So all the so-called language in the book, no matter you call it language, character, icon, emoji, none of them were really designed by myself. It's all collected.
因为我觉得收集来的，它带有这个文字的性质，就是它是约定俗成的，就是别人可以懂的。
Because I feel from collection it has a quality of language, it has a convention to it, so that people can understand.
其实这个书读起来其实挺容易的，比如我们试着读哈，这个当然前后，这本书就是讲一个白领一个标准的人的一天24小时的生活所以呢，白天12个小时，这个晚上12个小时这实际上是在他中午这个吃完午饭以后有时间呢，他去给朋友买礼物比如说你看他进了那个书店然后他东看西看，在找这些书然后呢，他看到一本书是吧是讲这个爱情的，知道吧讲这个爱情。
So this book is actually quite easy to read. It's a story about a white-collar worker and how he spends his day, 12 hours in the morning, 12 hours at night. And this particular part is about after lunch, how he goes to buy a gift for his, I guess, lover. And he went to the bookshop and then he buys a book about love.
然后呢，他这个后来又看，那块的书的区域呢是讲这种什么那个凶杀的是吧？你看凶杀的，对，他觉得有点不太好，因为实际上他是给他的一对朋友要结婚，在准备礼物。
Okay, so he's not actually buying it for the lover, he is buying it for a couple that is going to get married. So later on, after the first book about love, then the second book is actually about murder, and the third book about travel, I guess. So he was just weighing the different options.
对，看到一本那个就是旅游的书是吧？然后他挺高兴，他在想那个想的符号是吧？括号里面，这两个人可以去旅行、结婚什么的，特好。所以呢，他就给他打了个电话那个时候出这书的时候还没有我们这个特别的 iPhone 8、iPhone 7什么的，很旧的那种手机，给他们俩打电话，然后呢，他们俩要不要去旅行结婚是吧？一个问号然后呢，他们想去哪儿然后说是去纽约或者去巴黎。
So he was actually very happy to find this book, and then he was thinking that the couple can take the book and they can get married and go to travel, and that's a very good idea. And then the man makes a phone call, even though this is like before the iPhone came out. So he makes a phone call to the couple and suggests that to ask them whether they think it's a good idea getting married and go to travel, and then the man thinks maybe we should go to America, and then the woman thinks maybe we should go to Paris.
You've heard the Mandarin version. Now you can look at the English alongside it. You can understand why I used that image on the book cover. It's there. And just to end this bit, I could say that Joyce was James Joyce was as quixotic about his own book that he also believed that it was not going to be Tian Shu, which is most people's experience of Finnegan's Wake, but actually that it would be a book from the ground that everybody would be able to read it. And that some Kiswahili boy in the middle of Africa would suddenly see the word Maji in there. But that was Joyce. He had big ambitions for his book. But I think we are very happy to take some questions from the floor. There's one there. Actually, Barbara, can we put some lights on? Sorry. Thanks. So you may have to just adjust your eyes. We're going to go from darkness to kind of operating theatre brightness.
It's pretty interesting translating from from the ground, because I was not translating from the Chinese anymore, just translating from the picture.
Yeah, sure. Yes, there was one question. Can everybody hear? Because we do have microphones.
我用中文可以吗？刘老师，谢谢你。我记得就是第一次看你的那个英文方块字，我当时在澳大利亚长大，当时就是要学英文还有中文一起。然后我梦里呢是就是其实发梦那时是有你那种就是英文方块字在我就是那个过程，所以我觉得是今天讲的就是语言这个就是。我觉得你的这个英文方块字就是对我来说体验的很有意思，因为 Peter 教授也就是说，这个 Joyce 他那本Finnegan's Wake， 其实呢很多人说他这一个 Joyce 他那个技巧呢是用就是他想重新创造就是睡眠还有发梦想的那种体验，然后我就觉得就是你可能。也有这样的影响嘛，就是发梦还有梦想这方面在你的就是作品上有什么就是影响？So basically the question is about what is the role of dreams in Shubing's work, because Finnegan's Wake is sort of, some people say Joyce's attempt to recreate dreams and sleep. So.
你说实际上我没有这么浪漫，或者说我没有这么那个违心啊，因为在我这样的一个生长环境呢，确实是我们比较关注社会现实。其实这个像英文方块字这样的作品呢，其实就是因为我生活在两个不同的文化的中间地带。
So actually, I was not that. I'm not that romantic and subjective. It's just to do with the social reality in which I was living in, and I see myself as living in the two different, in between space of two different cultures.
当然，这个是一个就是外在的一个原因啊。但实际上，总体来说，我的作品呢，我喜欢对人的这个习惯的思维。进行一种挑战。
That was just a circumstantial reason for my philosophy, but what I try to confront is always the conventional ways of thinking embedded in our knowledge.
对，其实我喜欢就是说制造一些东西，让我们现有的思维的。范畴和概念，或者知识和范畴的概念所无法判断。
So what I'm trying to make is always something that cannot be judged by the existing value systems or knowledge systems.
其实文字呢，我觉得它确实是，文字呢确实是，就是像这个日常的事物一样的，其实它是非常的普遍的，而且人们呢对文字呢一般来说是没有疑问的。
Language is like everyday objects and very common, and usually people don't have any doubt about language.
其实 Peter 教授这个书里其实也在谈到这种东西啊。那个，所以你对文字的改造，哪怕一点点，其实它对我们的这个思维的改造，其实是作用是成倍的。
Peter talks about this in his book as well. So actually, if you reform or reconstruct the language a little bit, it actually reshapes our ways of thinking as well.
所以为什么政权夺取政权和巩固政权，首先要做的事情就是要改造文字。
That is why when regime shifts, the first thing usually they do is to change the language systems.
对，其实你刚才你来自于澳大利亚啊，其实前几年我还收到澳大利亚教育部的一封信，这封信就是问我可以不可以把英文方块字这个体系的东西放在他们的新的 IQ 测验的这个系统里。
So you're from Australia. Actually, several years ago, I got a letter from the Ministry of Education in Australia asking me whether they can put my square word calligraphy into their IQ test.
The one thing I could quickly just add on the back of that is it definitely one of my own ambitions in this book was to rescue Finnegan's Wake from that reading, that it is somehow a subjectivist dream text, which is interestingly the way in which Salman Rushdie read it and fed into the Satanic Verses, that version of Finnegan's Wake. But in fact what I'm trying to do is shift away from that and to recognize that the Wake is koan-like in the public matter for thought, because what Joyce was taking on, and this is in a sense one of the things I argue in the book, was the foundations of the modern state in general, certainly the Europeanized conception of a modern state, in which language can often play a very central part. But the other thing he's also taking on, of course, is the English language. And it's no surprise that faced by a colonial imposed foreign language in Ireland, Joyce is confronting that, but he's confronting it in a very innovative and new way. Which in a sense post-colonial studies has not even really engaged with. On the one hand, he was refusing the gesture of how do you react to that? You return to the mother tongue. So you recuperate, in his case it would be Gaelic, Irish. But on the other hand, you indigenize English. That's the other way of approaching this problem. Joyce's inventive response to that was, okay, this is this colonially imposed language. What I do is I re-foreignize it. So Finnegan's Wake is a much more public, moving away from that dreamscape reading. Should we take this question at the front and then there's two at the back? We'll work our way backwards. Yeah.
感谢徐根老师和 Peter Flyer 的翻译其实我有一个问题，因为我是来自精神分析的背景然后刚才您有一幅作品是 A Case for Transference。因为 transference 疫情是一个精神分析中非常重要的概念，也是一个核心。我其实想问这个作品背后您的一些思考，以及它是否跟精神分析有一些千丝万缕之类的联系。
So what I want to ask is about the work, a case study of transference, because transference is such an important concept in psychoanalysis. So I'm just wondering whether Xubing has any thoughts on psychoanalysis in relation to this work.
你说其实做的时候没有想到精神分析。
Actually, I didn't think about psychoanalysis when I made the work.
实际上那个时候呢，我那个时候很想尝试西方的当代艺术手法。
So what I was trying really hard to do is to try the methods of Western contemporary art.
所以呢，这个因为我那时候觉得我的作品呢，整个在全球如果能够进入呢，是需要太沉重的、太多的这种背景的准备啊。
Because I'm thinking if my works have to enter the international space, it has to take a lot of heavy preparation.
这是当时的一个我的思维的局限性所致，所以呢，我想实验一种更直接的，这样的一种语言。
So that's the limitations of my thinking back then. So what I was trying to do is to make a more direct demonstration of what I'm thinking about.
所以这个呢，也让我认识到了西方或者说全球的当代艺术的语言的弊病。那件作品其实对我来说是相对来说简单一点的作品，但是就是由于它的简单，而它的影响却很大。
So this process had made me reflect on the drawbacks of the practices in Western contemporary art, and that work is actually very simple, and I think it's that simplicity that made it speak to very many people.
但是这个作品呢，其实和《天书》这个作品，其实在说的事情上，某种程度上是有类似之处的，虽然它们形式截然不同啊。因为呢，其实我都是。这个作品其实我都是等于是提供一个空间，让人们看着他们的一个行为，而反省我们人和文明之间的关系。
So this book, this work is actually in some ways similar to Book from the Sky, especially the ideas behind it, despite the formal differences, because it's trying to create a space in which we can doubt and reflect upon the relationship between human and civilization.
其实天书也是在谈这样的一种我们和文字和文明之间的关系。
And that's what the book from the sky is trying to discuss as well, the relationship between language, human beings, and civilization.
I think we probably have time for 2 more questions. So we did have, it's Cameron, you had your hand up. So we'll go Cameron, and I think, is it Elika at the back next? And we probably will have to end there, sorry, so that you can all get a drink. And we can talk more afterwards, certainly. So Cameron first, yeah.
I have opportunity to speak Chinese, but what part does punctuation play in your art? There seems to be a large focus on the latter, but but as people showed at the beginning of this talk, punctuation is also subject to change. Do you think much about punctuation in your art?
You understood?
标点对，刚才 Peter 书里也涉及到这个标点符号和这个空，就是说这个空白的这个部分。
So Peter actually mentioned this relationship between like the space you put before words and punctuation.
其实，在这书里面呢，我使用了几乎我能够认识到的所有的人类的表示符号。
So in Book from the Ground, I have tried to use almost all the expressive symbols human beings can use.
这个我们可以看到，这里面其实有很多的标点符号，就是对。
So you can tell from this picture that there are lots of punctuation in it.
其实中国古代的这个书写呢是没有空格，也没有标点符号。
Actually, in ancient Chinese writing, there was no spaces or punctuation between words.
其实是西方就成了白话以后。
So it only changed after the language was reformed following Westernization in the medieval period.
And of course, when it comes to punctuation, probably the one thing that everybody knows about Finnegan's Wake is that it's unpunctuated title, where I think most default assumption is that there's a missing apostrophe, that it should be Finnegan's apostrophe Wake. In fact, what Joyce is definitely open to is multiple non-phonetic science aspects of our writing system, which is punctuation. So he's very happy. In fact, I would say it's more important to punctuate it Finnegan's, comma, Wake! Exclamation mark. There's one more question at the back. It was Elika, yeah. You might have to speak up.
Thank you very much for this fascinating exchange between the two of you. This question is specifically for Peter. You said towards the end, I think, of the first segment about states as in nation states putting certain aspects of what you discuss in the book Peter under erasure. And then you had the example of Pakistan and Bangladesh with different spellings and different decodings of those names. I wonder if you could just say a bit more about this fascinating question of erasure and the way in which states put what you talked about under erasure.
I will be very brief on this because Elike is the worst thing you can ask somebody who's written a book and who's also an academic by profession is to talk about something that's that they're passionate about. So I will be extremely brief. But so one of the things is certainly that of course at a certain level a state itself is an artifact of writing. At least most are. We happen to be at the moment all temporary or semi-temporary or maybe permanent residents in probably the most famous state in the world not to have a formal written constitution, that being the United Kingdom, which I'm sure if anybody is following the Brexit debate knows causes all sorts of problems of its own. But most other states in the world do have formal written constitutions. So that's one of the ways in which they are themselves artifacts of writing. One of the key things that I'm interested in relation to that is that, of course, there's a history of English, which is interesting and complicated, in particular in relation to, say, South Africa, Ireland, and India. One of the odd things about that is these are both now, all three are now, of course, post-colonial states beyond the age of empire, but interestingly, because of their own internal language problems, each of their constitutions was drafted in English. But what they did in the case of, say, Ireland in particular, was it put Gaelic as the first language of Ireland. The recuperation of Gaelic was absolutely central to the founding of the Irish state, both in 1922 and in 1937. Exactly how language is then conceptualized and understood, and in particular, Joyce took exception to a Trinitarian Catholic, especially associated with Eamon de Valera, understanding of Gaelic as an expression of the Irish people. That notion that the language is somehow an expression of the people, instead of, as Joyce recognized and as Finnegan's Wake in a sense exemplifies, a mishmash of all sorts of borrowings and stealings and corruptions and appropriations from other languages, with of course a core in all sorts of ways. But it's languages and writing systems are themselves all mixed up and constantly on the move, never pinned down. But what states often try to do in their conceptualization, especially of an official language, is to fix or codify that language in some way. And so that's one of the ways in which it certainly impacts on the questions that I'm asking. Yeah. But I think we should probably draw the proceedings to a close there. I know everybody must be extremely thirsty. There is some drinks in the door behind you on the left over there. Please do go and help yourselves. There are books on sale at the front here as well. Please do go and help yourselves with a credit card. And I'd just like to thank you all for coming and thank Xu Bing for for his enormous labour of translation.